This is the July 1st, 2020 World News Rundown with me, your host, Touring News. In the United States, the Supreme Court gives religious schools more access to state aid. Religious schools should have the same access to scholarships and funds as other private schools, the justices ruled in a victory for conservatives. The Supreme Court ruled on Tuesday that states must allow religious schools to participate in programs that provide scholarships to students attending private schools, a decision that opened the door to more public funding of religious education. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who has proposed a tax credit program to help parents pay for private schools, called the decision a historic victory that meant families can use taxpayer funds to choose schools that match their values and education goals, including faith-based schools. The court's 5-4 decision, with the more conservative members in the majority, did not directly affect public schools, but their supporters said they feared it would help divert resources from public to private education. Dissenting justices said the decision damaged the separation of church and state. The Supreme Court has long held that states may choose to provide aid to religious schools, along with other private schools. The question in the case, brought by three mothers with children at Stillwater Christian School in Kalispell, Montana, was the opposite of one. May states refuse to provide such aid if made available to other private schools. Montana's constitution, like those of many other states, restricts government aid to religious groups. Those provisions, often called Blaine Amendments, were initially adopted in the 19th century and often had the goal of restricting funding for Catholic schools. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority in the case Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue, said the provision of Montana's constitution ran afoul of the federal constitution's protection of free exercise of religion by discriminating against religious people in schools. A state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. In dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor said the majority opinion weakens this country's long-standing commitment to a separation of church and state beneficial to both. The court's ruling will have an immediate effect. Trump's Surgeon General says, please, please, please wear masks in testimony yesterday. The Trump administration's coronavirus task force stepped up its calls for Americans to wear masks as cases surged in some states, but Vice President Mike Pence said there are no plans to override governors who have yet to require them. Please, please, please wear a face covering when you go out in public, Surgeon General Jerome Adams, a member of the task force, said at a briefing on Tuesday. This was the strongest plea delivered yet from these offices. And yesterday, the United States had 48,000 new coronavirus-19 or COVID-19 cases. Police say 7 are arrested under the new security law in a Hong Kong update. Hong Kong police made their first arrests under sweeping national security legislation that has dramatically curtailed dissent in the city, less than 24 hours after Chinese lawmakers handed it down. Earlier in the day, Chief Executive Carrie Lam called the law the most important development in relations between Hong Kong and China since the city's handover from British rule in 1997, despite concerns about what the measure will mean for its future autonomy from the mainland. The legislation calls for sentences as long as life in prison for the most serious cases of terrorism, secession, subversion of state power, and collusion with foreign forces. The law came into force just ahead of the July 1st anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, a symbolic occasion usually marked by mass protests. Senators propose giving Hong Kong residents priority as refugees. Proposal in the United States Congress is a response to the Chinese security law. A bipartisan group of United States senators is proposing giving refugee status to Hong Kong residents at risk of persecution by the government for taking part in protests. The legislation was introduced Wednesday in response to the government in Beijing adopting a new national security law that asserts broad new powers over Hong Kong to rein in critics. Marco Rubio, Republican senator, and Todd Young, also Republican, have allied with Bob Menendez, Ben Cardin, and Jeff Merkley, Democrats, to sponsor the bill, which gives Hong Kong residents who participate in peaceful protests priority refugee status and waives immigration intent as a consideration in granting non-immigrant visas. Donald Trump vows to veto the defense bill to keep Confederate base names. President Donald Trump has threatened to veto the entire defense bill if it contains a provision that would strip the names of Confederate generals from U.S. military bases. Trump, in a tweet just before midnight, said, "I will veto the defense authorization bill if the Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren of all people amendment, which will lead to the renaming plus other bad things of Fort Bragg, Fort Robert E. Lee, and many other military bases from which we won 2 world wars, is in the bill." China adds the Associated Press, NPR, to U.S. media ordered to disclose their finances. China ordered more American news outlets to declare their finances and staff, in the latest tit-for-tat exchange with the U.S. over media access to each other's countries. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said Wednesday that China was asking for 4 organizations, including the Associated Press and National Public Radio, to disclose staffing, finances, and real estate holdings within 7 days. The move, which also affects CBS and United Press International, follows similar action in March against Voice of America and Time magazine. China's measures are entirely necessary and reciprocal to the unwarranted actions against Chinese media operating in the United States. Zhao told a regular news briefing in Beijing. China urges the United States to immediately reverse course and correct its mistakes. Israel signals the occupied West Bank annexation move is not imminent. Uncertainty over when Israel will begin its controversial process as Palestinians gather for renewed protests. Israel's foreign minister has suggested an announcement on the planned annexation of parts of the occupied West Bank was not imminent on Wednesday, the date set by Israel's coalition government to start the widely criticized process. The statement by Gabi Ashkenazi came a day after the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his government's discussions with the United States on the annexation plan would continue in the coming days, indicating he would miss the self-imposed July 1st target to begin the debate on the controversial issue. I reckon there will be nothing today, Ashkenazi said, a member of the centrist Blue and White Party that eventually partnered up with Netanyahu's right-wing Likud after 3 inconclusive elections. Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan says there was no doubt that India was behind a deadly attack. However, Imran Khan offered no evidence for his allegation but said there had been intelligence reports warning of the attacks. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has told Parliament he had no doubt that India was behind a deadly attack on the stock exchange building in the southern city of Karachi. 4 gunmen armed with grenades attacked the Pakistan Stock Exchange on Monday, killing 2 guards and a policeman before security forces killed them. There is no doubt that India is behind the attack, Khan said in his address to Parliament on Tuesday, a charge that India denied a day earlier. Khan offered no evidence for the allegation, but said there had been intelligence reports warning of attacks in Pakistan and he had informed his cabinet about the threat. He said the attackers were heavily armed and wanted to take hostages to replicate the 2008 Mumbai attacks in which more than 160 people were killed. Khan termed their failure to do so and the rapid response as a big victory. The Baloch Liberation Army, BLA, an armed separatist group from the southwestern province of Balochistan, claimed responsibility for the attack in a message on Twitter. The group has officially been officially banned in Pakistan since 2006 and was classified by the United States as a global terrorist group last July. 1 person was killed in Sudan as thousands rally for faster reform. Several others wounded as police used tear gas to disperse them, protesters calling for greater civilian rule. 1 person was killed and several others injured in largely peaceful demonstrations in Sudan, a government spokesman said, as tens of thousands of people took to the streets demanding faster reform and greater civilian rule in the country's transition towards democracy. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets in Sudanese cities on Tuesday, despite a coronavirus lockdown, to demand a transition toward democracy after the removal of longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir last year. Waving Sudanese flags, demonstrators gathered in the capital of Khartoum and in its twin cities, Khartoum North and Omdurman, after the government closed roads and bridges leading to the center of the capital. Police used tear gas to disperse protesters marching on a road leading to the airport in Khartoum. There were no immediate reports of casualties. Similar protests also took place in Kassala in eastern Sudan and in the rest of region of Darfur. They chanted freedom, peace, and justice, the slogan of the anti-al-Bashir movement. The Million Man March was called by the Sudanese Professionals Association and the so-called resistance committees, which were instrumental in the protests against al-Bashir and the generals who took over power for months after his removal. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, a technocrat, governs the country in tandem with the long-dominant military that helped remove al-Bashir after mass protests against his 30-year rule. The protesters are demanding that justice has not been served over the killings of protesters since December 2018. They are saying the transitional government handed over major files to the military, which under the power-sharing deal were meant to oversee security issues and not day-to-day concerns such as the economy. The protest organizers also called for the appointment of civilian governors for Sudan's provinces and making peace with the country's rebels who were part of the power-sharing deal. They called for swift public trials for al-Bashir and top officials in his government. Iran Zarif says ending arms ban inseparable from nuclear deal. As the United States tries to rally support to extend United Nations arms embargo on Iran, it faces skepticism from UNSC members. Iran said the preservation of its nuclear accord with world powers depends on the scheduled end in October of a United Nations arms embargo as the United States seeks to end it. The timetable for removal of arms restrictions embodied in Resolution 2231 2231, is an inseparable part of the hard-won compromise, Iranian Foreign Affairs Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif told a United Nations Security Council session, referring to the resolution that blessed the 2015 deal aimed to curb the Islamic Republic's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Any attempt to change or amend the agreed timetable is thus tantamount to undermining Resolution 2231 in its entirety. His comments were made after United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo urged the United Nations body to extend the embargo on Iran. Undue pressure. New report alleges Boeing hid key 737 MAX data. Following fatal crashes, United States government report says regulators, officials are too deferential to Boeing. United States-based plane maker Boeing Company failed to submit certification documents to the United States Federal Aviation Administration detailing changes to a key flight control system faulted in 2 fatal crashes, a long-awaited government report has found. The flight control system, known as MCAS, was not an area of emphasis because Boeing presented it to the FAA as a modification of the jet's existing speed trim system. Sorry for that delay. The flight control system, known as MCAS, was not an area of emphasis because Boeing presented it to the FAA as a modification of the jet's existing speed trim system with limited range and use, according to the report seen by the Reuters news agency. The 52-page report by the United States Department Transportation's Office of Inspector General, dated June 29th and set to be made public on Wednesday, today, laid bare mistakes made both by the plane maker and the FAA in the development and certification of Boeing's top-selling aircraft. The FAA and the IG did not immediately respond to a request for comment. A Boeing spokesman said the company had taken steps to enhance safety and was committed to transparency. When the MAX returns to service, it will be one of the most thoroughly scrutinized aircraft in history, and we will have full confidence in its safety. The IG's report is the latest one faulting the plane's approval, while the Justice Department has an ongoing criminal investigation. How India's TikTok ban could dent China's global tech ambitions. After India-China border clash, New Delhi's ban on Chinese apps may strengthen the United States' push against China tech firms. China, over the past decade, built an alternate online reality where Google and Facebook barely exist. Now, its own largest tech corporations, from Alibaba Holding Group to Tencent Holdings Limited, are getting a taste of what a shutout feels like. India's unprecedented decision to ban 59 of China's largest apps is a warning to the country's tech giants who, for years, thrived behind a government-imposed Great Firewall that kept out many of America's best-known internet names. If India finds a way to carry out that threat, it may present a model for other countries from Europe to Southeast Asia that seek to curtail the pervasiveness of apps like ByteDance Limited's TikTok while safeguarding the citizens' enormously valuable data. The surprise moratorium hit Chinese internet companies just as they were beginning to make headway in the world's fastest-growing mobile arena, en route to going global and challenging American tech industry supremacy. TikTok had signed up 200 million users there. Xiaomi Core is the number 1 smartphone brand, and Alibaba and Tencent have aggressively pushed their services. But India's policy jeopardizes all those successes and could have wider geopolitical consequences as the United States seeks to rally countries to stop using Huawei Technologies company for 5G networks. With China's tech companies poised to become some of the most dominant in emerging industries like artificial intelligence, India's actions may spur countries around the world to weigh the extent to which they let China gain user data and potentially economic leverage in future disputes. The United States FCC designates Huawei and ZTE as national security threats, and they claim we cannot and will not allow the Chinese Communist Party to exploit network vulnerabilities, the FCC chairman said. The FCC on Tuesday formally designated Chinese firms Huawei Technologies and ZTE Core as posing threats to United States national security, a declaration that bars United States firms from tapping a $8.3 billion government fund to purchase equipment from the companies. The U.S. telecom regulator voted in November 5-0 to issue the declaration and proposed requiring rural carriers to remove and replace equipment from the 2 Chinese companies from existing U.S. networks. We cannot and will not allow the Chinese Communist Party to exploit network vulnerabilities and compromise our critical communications infrastructure, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai said in a statement on Tuesday. Huawei and ZTE did not immediately respond to requests for comment, but have previously sharply criticized the FCC's actions. Qatar eases more coronavirus restrictions as peak passes. And I apologize. I don't know if it's Qatar or Qatar. I have heard both. I am going with Qatar today. Thank you for bearing with me here. Limited reopening of restaurants, mosques, and beaches and parks, but public gatherings are now limited to 5 people from 10. Qatar is further easing its coronavirus restrictions, allowing a partial reopening of restaurants, mosques, beaches, and parks. Starting Wednesday, museums and libraries will also be permitted to operate in a limited capacity and under limited working hours, the country's Supreme Committee for Crisis Management said in a statement. Plotting our escape, Lebanon braces for a new emigration wave. Many Lebanese seek a way out as the country sinks into instability and economic collapse, but that is not easy. Shops have been shut, traffic lights are off, bread lines, fuel lines, little state provided electricity, little state provided anything. Lebanon's population is facing a deepening financial crisis that has made dignified life difficult, pushing many, especially the young, to seek a way out. We're like prisoners who do nothing but try to plot our escape, Bernard Haj, a 32-year-old cartoonist and graphic designer who goes by the name Art of Boo, told Al Jazeera. As the country's only international airport reopens on Wednesday after being shut down for 3.5 months due to COVID-19, many desperate Lebanese are looking to leave. But the effects of the crisis on the average person's purchasing power, Lebanon's currency has tumbled 80% in 8 months, erasing savings painstakingly built up over decades, has made the simple act of buying a plane ticket difficult. In somber news, Turkey, a boat carrying up to 60 refugees sinks in Lake Van. The lake is near the border with Iran, from where refugees regularly cross into Turkey to head west into Europe. Speaking to reporters in the Van province on Wednesday, Soylu said authorities detained 11 people in connection with the incident. Search and rescue operations continue, he said, adding that 6 bodies had been recovered so far. He said a total of 11 other people had been detained in connection with the tragedy. The information the Interior Minister has is dependent on the testimonies of the witnesses. International donors pledged $7.7 billion in humanitarian aid for Syria, and I believe they were trying to get $10 billion in aid. Pledges at the conference hosted by the United Nations and European Union were higher than expected, but aid groups warned the promised sum is not enough. International donors have pledged $7.7 billion in humanitarian aid for war-ravaged Syria at a virtual conference hosted by the United Nations and the European Union. While less than the almost $10 billion sought by the United Nations agencies, the funding promises on Tuesday were higher than expected, given the economic shock of the coronavirus pandemic and shortfalls in other aid appeals. We recognize that the circumstances are very unusual. It is a difficult moment in every country to find the resources necessary to relieve the suffering of the Syrian people. United Nations aid Chief Mark Lowcock said after the conference by some 60 governments and non-official agencies. Pledges came from countries including Germany, which offered 1.58 billion euros, in what Berlin said was the single biggest country donation, and Qatar promised 100 million. We have today expressed solidarity with the Syrian people, not only with words but with concrete pledges of support that will make a difference for millions of people, EU Crisis Management Commissioner Hannes Lenarkic said. The money pledge will be used to finance food, medical aid, and schooling for the millions of Syrians displaced or forced into exile, many of whom are living with food insecurity. However, aid group Oxfam said the sum was simply not enough. It is shocking that the international community has failed to recognize the urgency of the situation, Marta Lorenzo, Oxfam's Middle East and North Africa regional director, said in a statement. Pre-tax spree, Saudis pack shops, buy gold and cars before a VAT hike. The tripling of value-added tax to 15% is meant to boost Saudi revenues amid its worst ever economic decline. People in Saudi Arabia rushed to buy goods from imported fruit juices to cars ahead of a sharp rise in the VAT on July 1st, introduced by the oil-rich kingdom to boost state revenues amid its worst ever economic decline. The tripling of the VAT to 15% comes against a backdrop of lower consumer spending and an easing of inflation due to a 3-month coronavirus lockdown that was fully lifted on the 21st of June. Supermarkets in the capital Riyadh were packed over the weekend as shoppers stockpiled non-perishable foods. Furniture and appliance stores offered discounts to lure buyers. Demand has been very weak, but people are now actively buying ahead of the VAT, so there is demand. Egypt warns of an existential threat from the Ethiopia dam. Ethiopia argues the dam will bring electricity to more than 65 million people who currently live in complete darkness. Egypt has told the United Nations it faces an existential threat from a hydroelectric dam on the Blue Nile that Ethiopia plans to start filling in the coming weeks. At a virtual meeting with the United Nations Security Council on Monday, Egypt's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sameh Shoukry, warned of the conflict if the United Nations fails to intervene. He urged the Council to adopt a resolution that would give international clout to efforts to resolve the dispute over Ethiopia's dam, the filling of which, he said, endangers the lives of 150 million Egyptians and Sudanese. Shukri said the draft resolution is in line with the outcome of the African Union Summit on Friday, where the leaders of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia agreed to return to talks aimed at reaching an agreement over the filling of the $4.6 billion Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known by its initials GERD. The draft resolution is not intended to preempt or forestall any negotiations, but to express at the highest levels of deep interests of the international community in reaching an agreement on the GERD and its appreciation of the dangers of acts of unilateralism in this matter. If you would ever like to watch this broadcast live, you can find me at twitch.tv/Touring News, and after we record this video, we'll be watching a 25-minute video about this Ethiopian dam. To continue back to the news where we were, thank you for your time. France's Emmanuel Macron slams Turkey's criminal role in Libya. Turkey and France have engaged in a war of words in recent weeks over each other's role in war-torn Libya. France's president has accused Turkey of importing large numbers of fighters into Libya, labeling Ankara's intervention criminal. Emmanuel Macron has also lambasted Russian President Vladimir Putin's ambivalence towards his country's mercenaries operating in the oil-rich North African state. Turkey has recently intervened decisively in Libya, providing air support, weapons, and allied fighters from Syria to help internationally recognized government based in Tripoli repel a 14-month assault by renegade Eastern Commander Khalifa Haftar. I think it is a historic and criminal responsibility for a country which claims to be a NATO member, Macron said on Monday of Turkey's role in Libya. Without providing any evidence on the nature of the fighters, he said Turkey was massively importing them from Syria. Last week, Turkey heavily criticized France, saying Paris aims to restore old colonial rule in the North African country. Due to the support it has given to illegitimate structures for years, France has an important responsibility in dragging Libya into chaos, Foreign Ministry spokesman Hami Akzoy said. The people of Libya will never forget the damage France has inflicted on this country. Macron denied backing Haftar's east-based forces, saying France is in favor of finding a political solution. Ties between NATO allies France and Turkey have soured in recent weeks over Libya, northern Syria, and drilling in the eastern Mediterranean. Tensions escalated following a June 10th incident between Turkish warships and a French naval vessel in the Mediterranean Sea, which France considers a hostile act under NATO's rules of engagement. Turkey has denied harassing the French frigate. Paris has been accused of supporting Haftar politically, having previously given him military assistance. France has long denied backing Haftar, but has stopped short of rebuking his allies, especially the United Arab Emirates, which has also been signaled out by the United Nations for violating an arms embargo in Libya. Haftar's forces mobilized mercenaries for the Sirte battle as preparations for the Battle of Sirte intensify. Thousands of foreign fighters are on the way to the key city. DRC violence, Democratic Republic of Congo, displaced more than 1 million people in 6 months, says the United Nations. The UNHCR voices alarm at an increasing number of attacks by armed groups on displaced civilians in the African nation. More than 1 million people have been forced to flee their homes in the violence-ravaged Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo since the start of the year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said on Tuesday. The UNHCR voiced alarm at an increasing number of attacks by armed groups on displaced civilians, saying it was appalled by the surging violence. In the last 8 weeks, UNHCR and its partners have recorded multiple attacks by armed groups on displacement sites and villages. It added the attacks were mainly in the Jugu territory in Ituri province in Fizi and Mwenga territories in South Kivu province and Masisi and Rutshuru territories in North Kivu province. Violence has displaced more than 1 million people in the last 6 months in these areas. The UNHCR urged the authorities in the DRC to strengthen the police and military presence in the east to improve security situation and hold the perpetrators accountable. UNHCR is receiving accounts of the way armed groups are unleashing terror on people as they flee in displacement sites and hosting areas, and when they attempt to return, including reports of killing and mutilation, sexual violence, and looting, the agency said. The displaced population is also subject to reprisal attacks for their perceived support for the army by returning armed groups, once the army completes operations to clear areas and is no longer present. Thousands flee violence in Mozambique. An armed group is accused of rights abuses in Mozambique, and accusations are emerging against the army too. Nearly 1,000 people have been killed and more than 200,000 people displaced by an armed group in northern Mozambique. The fighters say they reject the government and want to establish political Islam. The army has failed to contain it and has itself been accused of rights abuses, Al Jazeera's Malcolm Webb reports. United Nations renews Mali peacekeeping force MINUSMA without personnel cuts. MOVE allows for the number of troops to continue to comprise up to 13,289 soldiers and 1,920 police officers. The United Nations Security Council has unanimously voted to extend the mandate of its 7-year peacekeeping force in Mali for another 12 months without any personnel cuts. Monday's renewal of the mission, known as MINUSMA, allows for the number of members to continue to comprise 13,289 soldiers and 1,920 police officers. The expected move signifies a temporary truce between the United States and France, both permanent Security Council members and veto power holders, according to analysts. For more than a year, the United States, the United Nations' biggest financial contributor, has regularly questioned the mission, which costs $1.2 billion annually, deeming it ill-suited to the continuing violence in the West African nation. Meanwhile, France, which has taken the most active military role of any foreign power in its former colony, sees MINUSMA as an essential component of a broad coalition forces currently attempting to root out armed groups. Mali is struggling to contain a multi-layered and complex conflict that erupted in 2012 and which has killed thousands of military and civilians since. Despite the presence of thousands of French and United Nations troops, the violence has engulfed the center of the country and spread to neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger. Attacks have grown fivefold between 2016 and 2020, with 4,000 people killed in 2019, up from around 770 people in 2016. Meanwhile, the number of people forced to leave their homes due to the rapidly deteriorating security situation in the region has surged from 600,000 internally displaced people recorded in May 2010 to 1.5 million in April 2020. Earlier this month, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the mission remains crucial. The renewal does commit to presenting a possible exit strategy for the mission by March 2021. India NLC power plant hit by second fatal explosion in 2 months. The government-run NLC power plant in Tamil Nadu state's Kudaluri district suffers the second blast in 2 months. A blast at a power plant in southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu's Kudaluri district has killed at least 6 people, an official from the state-run company and local police said, the second deadly boiler explosion in 2 months. 6 people died on the spot, said S. Latha, inspector at a local police station in Neyveli, adding that the incident in May killed 5 and injured 3 at the plant run by a lignite miner and electricity generator NLC. The incident occurred at Unit V of the NLC Power Plant 2, a company official said, adding that the unit was under shutdown when the mishap happened. The boiler was not in operation. We are investigating the incident. There was an explosion followed by a fire that injured the workers and contractual laborers. Pakistan mango farmers hit hard by COVID-19 and locust attacks. Suspended flights and high freight charges have brought down exports, and locust attacks have severely damaged the fruit. The locust swarm began in the northeastern region of Africa, spread across the Middle East, and now has made it into Pakistan and India, and as well really threatening the food supply in India. Mango farmers in Pakistan have been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic and locust attacks. Pakistan is the world's 5th largest mango producer after India, China, Thailand, and Indonesia. Myanmar finds troops guilty in the Rohingya atrocities court-martial. In rare action, 3 military officers found guilty as Myanmar faces genocide charges at the United Nations Court over the 2017 crackdown. 3 Myanmar military officers have been found guilty by a court-martial investigating atrocities against the Rohingya in conflict-ridden Rakhine state, the army announced. The rare action against members of the military on Tuesday comes as Myanmar faces charges of genocide at the United Nations top court over a brutal 2017 crackdown against the Rohingya. Some 750,000 mostly Muslim Rohingya fled to the neighboring Bangladesh during the crackdown, carrying with them accounts of widespread murder, rape, and arson. Rights groups accused security forces of committing atrocities in various villages, including Gudar Pian, where they alleged at least 5 shallow mass graves had been found. After initially denying allegations, the military stated the court-martial proceedings in September last year, admitting there had been a weakness in following instructions in the village. Taliban Pompeo discussed peace in call amid the Russian bounty scandal. Conference comes amid reports that Trump knew about the Taliban-linked fighters being offered Russian bounties to kill United States troops. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has spoken with the Taliban's chief negotiator, a spokesman for the armed group said, amid controversy in Washington over reports that the President Donald Trump knew Russia had paid the Taliban bounties to kill U.S. troops. Pompeo and Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar held a video conference late on Monday in which Pompeo pressed the armed group to reduce violence in Afghanistan and discuss ways of moving a peace deal signed between the United States and the Taliban in February forward, Taliban spokesman Suhail Sahin tweeted. However, there was apparently no mention during the call of allegations that some Taliban fighters received money to kill U.S. and NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. Nepal families face hunger as coronavirus crisis hits remittances. More than 56% of Nepal's 5.4 million households are affected as remittances drop due to the global recession. Similar to Lebanon, the Nepalese economy relies on Nepalese expats to send money back into the nation so they can sustain themselves. This is leading to severe food insecurity in the region. Civilians killed in a rocket attack on Afghanistan cattle market. This is a 2-day-old, potentially 3-day-old story. At least 23 people were killed, dozens were wounded after 4 rockets hit the market in the Sangin district in the Helmand province. At least 23 civilians were killed and dozens injured after rockets hit a cattle market in Afghanistan's southern Helmand province, the Afghan government and Taliban officials said. The warring sides blamed each other for Monday's attack on the open-air cattle weekly market in the Sangin district, where hundreds of villagers from neighboring districts had gathered to trade sheep and goats. A spokesman for the Helmand's governor said the several rockets fired by Taliban fighters landed close to the cattle market, killing 23 civilians. Taliban officials blamed the government officials for killing civilians. The government officials blamed the Taliban officials. Facebook bans hundreds of accounts tied to violent boogaloos. Facebook will remove groups, accounts, and pages connected to violence or that are a credible threat to public safety. Facebook on Tuesday announced it had banned a violent anti-government network loosely associated with the broader Boogaloo movement, a slang term supporters use to refer to a second United States Civil War or a collapse of civilization. But the platform did not try to name the group, underscoring the difficulty of grappling with an amorphous network linked to a string of domestic terror plots that appears to obfuscate its existence. Among other complications, its internet-savvy members tend to keep their distance from one another, frequently change their symbols and catchphrases, and mask their intentions with sarcasm. The move by Facebook designates the group as a dangerous organization similar to ISIS group and white supremacists, both of which are already banned from its service. The social network is not banning all references to Boogaloo, and said it's only removing groups, accounts, and pages that have a clear connection to violence or a credible threat to public safety. Highly uncertain outlook for global labor market, United Nations warns. Worldwide, 14% of working hours were lost in the second quarter, equal to 400 million jobs, the ILO estimates. The outlook for the global labor market in the second half of 2020 is highly uncertain, and the forecast recovery will not be enough for employment to return to pre-pandemic levels this year, the International Labor Organization said on Tuesday. In the latest report, the United Nations agency said the fall in global working hours was significantly worse than previously estimated in the first half of the year. The Americas was the hardest hit region, losing 18.3% of working hours. Worldwide, an estimate of 14% of working hours were lost in the second quarter, equivalent to 400 million jobs. It's estimated that working hour losses were likely to still be in the order of 4.9% in the fourth quarter, equivalent to 140 million full-time jobs. However, under a pessimistic scenario in a so-called second wave of the pandemic, this figure could rise to 11.9%, or 340 million jobs. Venezuela to hold parliamentary elections in December. Polls to be held for expanded number of seats in new National Assembly as main opposition parties announce the boycott. Venezuela will hold elections in December to renew the National Assembly, the only constitution where the opposition has a majority, the country's electoral authority has announced. Candidates will contest an expanded number of seats in the new legislature, which will increase from 167 to 277. Indira Alfonso, who was named chief of the National Electoral Council by the Maduro-friendly Supreme Court earlier this month, said on Tuesday. We unanimously debated and built the special rules that will govern this December's parliamentary elections, Alfonso said, announcing the increase in seats. President Nicolas Maduro welcomed the electoral authority's announcement, adding that a socialist party is already working with allied organizations to nominate candidates. We will prepare for the birth of a new National Assembly, he said, speaking on official television VTV. Amazon deforestation may hurt Brazil's corn yields, a study warns. Researchers linked deforestation to a 5 to 10% drop in corn yields in Brazil's largest grain-producing region. Deforestation of the Brazilian Amazon and neighboring savanna may be hurting regional corn yields. Roughly one-fifth of Brazil's Amazon has been cleared in the past 50 years. Oh my God. Roughly one-fifth of Brazil's Amazon has been cleared in the last 50 years, as the country went from being a food importer to a global farming powerhouse. In terms of corn, Brazil is now the world's largest second exporter after the United States. But that forest clearing, which also included more than half of the natural vegetation in the vast Cerrado savanna southeast of the Amazon, has made the region warmer. That heat is associated with lower corn yields, researchers reported in the science journal Nature Sustainability. The landscape is getting hotter than it should be, said co-author Stephanie Spera, an environmental scientist with the University of Richmond. We're messing with the system so much that we actually might not be able to continue to cultivate agriculture, specifically corn. Healthcare workers protest across France in a push for better pay. The rallies come as the government prepares to wrap up weeks of talks with healthcare workers on hospital overhauls. Doctors, nurses, and other hospital staff have staged protests across France demanding pay hikes and budget increases for a healthcare system that was pushed to the edge by the coronavirus pandemic. The rallies came on Tuesday as the government prepares for Friday's wrap-up of weeks of talks with healthcare workers on hospital overhauls in the crisis. Employees have long complained about insufficient staff and low pay that prompts doctors and nurses to take jobs at private clinics instead. That issue led to a series of strikes over the past year. Prime Minister Edouard Philippe promised significant pay increases when kicking off talks last month, and officials have already put an additional 6.3 billion euros on the table. But that amount falls far short from many employees. They say French healthcare workers are already among the lowest paid among the group of developed countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as OECD nations, because of the year's budget cuts. United Kingdom Boris Johnson unveils a $6 billion plan to build back the economy. Much of the spending will go to building or repairing hospitals, roads and bridges, transport and schools. They are going to be fast-tracking the infrastructure investment to build out of the coronavirus crisis. He pledged £1.5 billion for hospital maintenance, as well as, I believe, £1.23 billion to build 50 new schools on a 10-year school rebuilding program. Croatian police brutality against migrants reported to Austria. Austria's parliament receives a 1,600-page report documenting Croatian border police brutality against irregular migrants. A Bosnian volunteer has handed over more than 1,600 pages of media reports and personal testimonies to Austria's parliament documenting the brutality of Croatia's border police against irregular migrants. Zahida Bihorak, a Bosnian volunteer from Velika Kladuša in northern Bosnia, spoke to the Austrian lawmakers on behalf of the SOS Balkan Route, a humanitarian organization. They have nowhere to go. They are stuck in Velika Kladuša, said Bihorak, calling the European Union to take action. Migrants and refugees enter the EU irregularly and cross the Croatian-Bosnian border to reach Germany and northern European countries. Germany investigates 30,000 suspects in a pedophilia probe. Germany's North Rhine-Westphalia state probes 30,000 people who shared child and youth pornographic content online. The cybercrime unit in the North Rhine-Westphalia is investigating 30,000 unknown suspects in the case. We want to drag perpetrators and supporters of child abuse out of the anonymity of the internet, the ministry said on Twitter. Those being investigated are suspected of sharing child and youth pornographic content, including fictitious and or real acts of abuse, in an anonymous online discussion forum and chat groups, the cybercrime unit ZAC-NWR said. I did not expect not even remotely the extent of child abuse on the internet, they said. We must recognize that child abuse on the internet is more widespread than we previously thought. Australia prepares massive defense boost in a dangerous world. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says additional spending will include long-range missiles, risking China response. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has announced plans to boost defense spending by 40% over the next 10 years, including investing in long-range missiles as part of effort to deter or respond to aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. In a major policy speech on Wednesday, Morrison said Australia will spend 270 billion Australian dollars, 186.5 billion US dollars over the next 8 years to acquire longer-range strike capabilities across air, sea, and land. He warned the country is facing economic and strategic uncertainty not seen in the region since World War I, for reasons including tensions between the United States and China, as well as the novel coronavirus pandemic. What does China's national security law for Hong Kong say? Below are some details on the law, which came into effect at 1500 Greenwich Mean Time on Tuesday. Crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces punishable by up to life in prison. The activities of a new National Security Council and its personnel in Hong Kong will not be under the jurisdiction of local government. The central government in Beijing has an overarching responsibility for national security affairs in Hong Kong. Anyone convicted of violating security legislation will not be allowed to stand in Hong Kong elections. Rights and freedoms, including freedom of speech, of the press, of publication, of assembly and demonstration, will be protected in accordance with the law. Companies or groups that violate national security law will be fined and could have operations suspended. Damaging certain transportation vehicles and equipment will be considered an act of terrorism. Authorities can surveil and wiretap persons suspected of endangering national security. The law will apply to permanent and non-permanent residents of Hong Kong. The law says the management of foreign NGOs and news agencies in Hong Kong will be strengthened. Hong Kong leader will appoint judges for national security under the law. Property-related crimes under the legislation could be frozen or confiscated. Mainland authorities will exercise jurisdiction in complex cases, such as those involving a foreign country or serious situations that pose a major or imminent threat to national security. Returning to domestic United States news. Economist Nouriel Roubini expects anemic United States recovery and a greater depression looms during a 15-minute interview with Yahoo Finance. Nouriel Roubini claims there is going to be a greater depression throughout the 2020s due to 10 different factors that he stated during the interview. He is claiming there will be a huge amount of uncertainty on labor income, and my labor cost is somebody else's labor income and consumption, so firms have to increase savings and reduce investment. He also claimed there are going to be problems as nations around the world must decide, are they going to use European Union 5G, which could be up to 50% more expensive than Chinese 5G, leading to further rising geopolitical tensions. United States buys up the world stock of a key COVID-19 drug, remdesivir. No other country will be able to buy remdesivir, which can help recovery from COVID-19 for the next 3 months at least. The United States has bought up virtually all the stocks for the next 3 months of one of the two drugs proven to work against COVID-19, leaving none for the United Kingdom, Europe, or most of the world. I am pretty sure they have bought, here it is, 100% of the doses for June, and the Trump administration has now bought more than 500,000 doses, which is all of Gilead's production for July and 90% of their production for August and September. President Trump has struck an amazing deal to ensure Americans have access to the first authorized therapeutic for COVID-19, said the United States Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar. To the extent possible, we want to ensure that any American patient who needs remdesivir can get it. The Trump administration is doing everything in our power to learn about life-saving therapeutics for COVID-19 and secure access to these options for the American people. This has led to nervous tensions for world governments where they cannot access these drugs, and it's also making people take into question, is this what's going to happen if a vaccine for COVID-19 is going to be developed? Taiwan sees a threat as China strengthens its grip on Hong Kong. The sweeping new security law in Hong Kong has further eroded what little support there was in Taiwan for unifying with the mainland. Now the incentives are gone, and the warnings seem more ominous following Mr. Xi's swift move to strengthen China's grip on Hong Kong. Senate approves extending the small business program. The Senate granted 5 additional weeks for the remaining money left in the PPP program. The Senate voted Tuesday evening to extend a federal loan program by 5 additional weeks, a surprise move that would allow businesses weathering the pandemic to continue receiving aid. Less than 4 hours before the PPP program was scheduled to end, with more than $130 billion in loan money unspent, the Senate approved extending the application period until the 8th of August. The legislation now heads to the House, which had finished voting before the bill cleared the Senate, and will require President Trump's signature for the program to continue. Members of both chambers are expected to leave Washington for the 4th of July and are not set to return for 2 weeks. New York judge blocks publication of Trump tell-all until a July hearing. The book, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, is scheduled to be published late this month. A judge in Dutchess County, New York, on Tuesday temporarily blocked publication of a tell-all book by President Trump's niece, Mary L. Trump, that is currently scheduled for release July 28th. Judge Hal Greenwald of the New York State Supreme Court issued the temporary restraining order until on July 10th to decide whether Mr. Trump's book, Too Much is Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, violated a confidentiality agreement she signed with other members of the virus in connection with a dispute over the estate of Fred Trump Sr., the president's father. The judge acted in response to the court action filed by Robert S. Trump, the president's brother, against Miss Trump and Simon Schuster, the book's publisher. Miss Trump is the daughter of Fred Trump Jr., who died in 1981. Growing number of Republicans urge mask usage. Some GOP lawmakers and conservative media figures hope President Trump will wear and promote masks to help prevent the spread of coronavirus. A growing chorus of Republican office holders and conservative media figures are calling for the people to wear masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus, with some urging President Trump to publicly wear one as cases soar around the country. The only way we put this in the rearview mirror is with the vaccine, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday. In the meantime, what we're all trying to demonstrate is for everybody in the country is the single most important thing you can not only do to protect yourself but to protect others is to put on a mask. It is not complicated. And in the final report, actually there are one or two others, I apologize. What Americans need to know about Europe's travel ban. The EU and other European countries will begin welcoming some non-essential travelers on July 1st, but Americans will not be on the list, at least at first. Here are the answers to the questions. Who is going to be allowed to enter the European Union? Residents from Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, and Uruguay will be allowed entry, along with Andorra, San Marino, Monaco, and the Vatican, as well as China, as long as they are subject to confirmation of reciprocity, that is, if the country will open its borders to European travelers. CDC expresses substantial disappointment with American Airlines for resuming full flights amid the coronavirus. A top CDC and prevention official on Tuesday expressed substantial disappointment with American Airlines for announcing it will resume full flights starting Wednesday. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent senator from Vermont, asked the CDC director Robert Redfield during a hearing on the coronavirus about the new policy. Obviously, when they announced that the other day, Redfield said, there was substantial disappointment with American Airlines. We do not think it sends the right message. United States coronavirus cases on June 30th, 2020, reached a new high of 48,000 cases in one day. This brings us to the end of today's World News Update. I was your host, Touring News. Thank you very much for coming in and watching the video. If you like this content, you can hit the like button or subscribe down below. You can find me live on my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Touring News, or you can find me on Twitter at Touring News 1. The show is run entirely off donations. If you ever want to support me, I do have a PayPal and a Patreon. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day today.